That Sunday dinner at her parents' house ended with me walking out the front door while my wife sat there in shock, her mother's fork frozen halfway to her mouth, and her father staring at me like I'd just announced I was joining a cult. But I'm getting ahead of myself because the real story started months earlier when I first noticed my wife's phone was always face down on the table and she'd started talking about freedom like it was a religion. I'm a mechanic, 28 years old, and for exactly 1 year and 3 months I was married to a woman I'll call Michaela. She was 27, worked some office job downtown that she complained about constantly, and for that first year everything seemed normal, maybe even boring in that comfortable way where you stop dressing up for date night and start finishing each other's sentences. I worked at an auto shop 6 days a week, came home smelling like motor oil and brake fluid, and we'd settle into our evening routine of takeout and television without much conversation. Looking back now, I can see that the silence wasn't comfortable at all. It was just the calm before everything fell apart. But at the time, I genuinely thought we were happy, or at least content enough to keep going. The first real sign something was wrong came around month 10 of our marriage when I realized Michaela's phone was never face up anymore. Every time she set it down on the kitchen counter or the coffee table or the nightstand, it was always screen down, like she protecting state secrets instead of just scrolling through social media. I didn't say anything because I'm not the jealous type, and honestly, I figured maybe she was planning some surprise for our anniversary or buying me a birthday gift online. Stupid, naive thoughts that make me cringe now when I remember them. Then came the zoning out during conversations where I'd be telling her about my day, and I'd look up to see her staring at nothing with this distant expression like her mind was somewhere else entirely. She started listening to these podcasts during her commute, self-improvement stuff and relationship theory, and all this pseudo-intellectual content about breaking free from societal conditioning. Suddenly, she was using words like authentic self and limiting beliefs and societal constructs in regular conversation, like she'd taken some online course in how to sound deep without actually saying anything meaningful. The questions started casual enough that I barely noticed them at first. She'd ask things like whether I thought people were naturally monogamous or if marriage was just a social invention or whether true love meant giving someone complete freedom. I'd usually respond with something sarcastic because that's how I deal with uncomfortable topics. I'd say something like, "Sure, babe, humans are basically wolves, very deep." And she'd get this annoyed look but drop it. But she never really dropped it because a few days later there'd be another question, another article sent to my phone, another podcast clip playing in the car about ethical non-monogamy or polyamory or whatever trendy relationship model she'd discovered that week. The articles started showing up in our text thread with just a little interesting attached, like she was innocently sharing content instead of systematically building a case for something. Studies about how monogamy was invented for property rights. Think pieces about how multiple partners could strengthen a relationship. Personal essays from people in open marriages talking about their journey to enlightenment or whatever. I'd skim them and send back non-committal responses because I genuinely didn't know where she was going with all this, and part of me didn't want to find out. Her whole personality shifted into this enlightened phase where she talked about growth and evolution and how people who resist change are living in fear. She'd say things like, "Don't you think we put too many rules on love?" Or, "What if the problem isn't cheating, but the expectation of exclusivity?" And I'd just stare at her wondering when my wife turned into a philosophy major having a crisis. The turning point came on a Tuesday night about 2 months before that infamous dinner when she sat me down and actually asked directly if I'd ever considered opening our marriage. She framed it as exploration and honesty and taking our relationship to the next level of trust. All these pretty words that basically meant she wanted permission to sleep with other people. I looked at her sitting there on our couch in our apartment that we decorated together, and I said very calmly, "If you want an open marriage, then I want to be single." And I watched her face go through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds. She backtracked immediately, said she was just curious and exploring ideas and didn't mean anything serious by it. But we both knew that was garbage. The tension in our apartment after that conversation was thick enough to cut with a knife, but we both pretended everything was fine. We went to work and came home and ate dinner and watched TV like that talk never happened. But I knew something was coming. I could feel it building like pressure before a storm, and I started preparing myself mentally for whatever bomb she was going to drop next. Then came that Sunday dinner at her parents' house, the one I mentioned at the start. We drove over separately because I was coming from work and she'd taken the day off, so I walked in still wearing my work clothes with grease probably still on my hands. Her mom had made pot roast. Her dad was watching football, Everything seemed normal until we sat down at the table and started eating. We got maybe 10 minutes into the meal, just small talk about work and weather and her sister's new apartment, when Michaela suddenly put down her fork and said, "Actually, we've been thinking about opening our marriage." Using that plural "we" like this was something we discussed and agreed on together. The table went silent. Her mother's mouth literally hung open. Her father looked at me like he was waiting for the punchline, and I felt this strange calm wash over me like I'd been waiting for this exact moment. I stood up from the table, pushed my chair back slowly, and said, "You want an open marriage? Then I'm single. Thanks for the meal." And I walked straight out the front door while Michaela started stammering something behind me. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove away while my phone started buzzing in my pocket with calls and texts that I didn't answer. I didn't know it then, but that walk to my truck was the easiest part of everything that was coming, and the real chaos hadn't even started yet. The drive home from her parents' house took maybe 20 minutes, but my phone buzzed the entire time with calls from Michaela, texts from her mom, even a missed call from her dad, which was weird because Dennis had maybe spoken 10 words to me in the entire year we'd been married. I didn't answer any of them because honestly, what was there to say at that point? She'd made her position clear, and I'd made mine clearer. When I finally pulled into our apartment complex, I sat in the truck for a few minutes, just staring at our building and thinking about how I'd spent a year of my life building something with someone who apparently wanted to tear it all down for some trendy idea of freedom she'd picked up from podcasts. I need to explain something here because people always ask why I reacted so strongly to the open marriage suggestion, why I didn't try to talk it through or go to counseling or any of that stuff people recommend when marriages hit rough patches. For me, marriage isn't just some piece of paper or legal arrangement. It's a promise that you're choosing one person over everyone else in the world every single day, even when it's boring or hard or inconvenient. My parents were married 32 years before my dad died, and I watched them choose each other through layoffs and medical scares and all the regular garbage life throws at people. And that's what I thought I was signing up for when I married Michaela. The whole concept of an open marriage felt like saying, I want the security and benefits of being married, but also the freedom to act like I'm single, which to me is just having your cake and eating it too, except someone else is paying for the cake. If you want to date multiple people, that's fine. Stay single and do whatever makes you happy, but don't put a ring on someone's finger and promise them forever and then decide actually forever sounds boring, so let's spice things up with other partners. It's not about being controlling or insecure or whatever people claim when they defend open relationships. It's about basic respect for the commitment you made and the person you made it to. When Michaela brought it up that first time, I knew immediately that this wasn't some theoretical discussion she was having. This was her testing the waters because she'd already met someone or wanted to meet someone and was looking for permission after the fact. I finally went inside our apartment, and she wasn't home yet, which gave me time to think clearly without her crying or explaining or whatever performance she was going to put on. I called my brother first because he's the only person I really trust with this kind of thing, and I told him everything that happened at dinner. He listened without interrupting and then said something that stuck with me. He said, "She didn't ask for an open marriage. She announced it in front of witnesses so you'd look like the bad guy for saying no." And that's when it clicked. She'd chosen her parents' dinner table specifically because she thought I wouldn't make a scene, thought I'd go along with it, or at least smile and nod, and we'd discuss it privately later, but instead I'd called her bluff, and now she was scrambling. My brother told me to call a lawyer first thing Monday morning, and I knew he was right, even though part of me still couldn't believe my marriage was actually ending over this. Michaela came home around 10 that night, and she immediately started with the tears and the explanations about how I'd misunderstood, and she wasn't actually suggesting we open the marriage, she was just starting a conversation about modern relationships. I sat on the couch and let her talk herself in circles for maybe 15 minutes before I finally said, "I'm filing for divorce," and watched her face go from sad to shocked to angry in about 3 seconds. She switched tactics then, went from crying to yelling about how I was overreacting and throwing away our marriage over nothing, and didn't I want to fight for us. I told her there was nothing to fight for because the moment she wanted other people involved, our marriage was already over. I was just making it official. She spent that night in the guest bedroom, and I lay awake in our bed thinking about how I'd been sharing a life with someone who apparently saw commitment as optional. Monday morning, I took a personal day from work and met with a lawyer that my brother recommended, an older guy named Patterson who'd handled his friend's divorce the year before. Patterson listened to my story and told me Washington State had no-fault divorce, which meant I didn't need to prove anything. Just file and wait out the mandatory separation period. He explained it would take at least 90 days minimum and probably longer if Michaela contested anything. But he could get the paperwork started immediately. I signed everything that afternoon and felt this weird mix of relief and sadness, like I was mourning something that had actually died months ago. The next few weeks were hell because Michaela went through every stage of manipulation in the playbook trying to stop the divorce. First, she tried reasoning with me, explaining that she'd never actually wanted an open marriage, she just wanted our relationship to grow and evolve. Then came the anger phase where she accused me of being closed-minded and traditional and afraid of real intimacy. Then back to sadness with her crying at random times and leaving notes around the apartment about how much she loved me. I stayed calm through all of it because I'd already made my decision and nothing she said was going to change the fundamental fact that she'd betrayed what marriage meant to both of us. Her parents called me twice. First, her mom trying to mediate and get us to go to counseling. Then her dad, which surprised me because, like I said, Dennis wasn't much of a talker. He told me he understood why I walked out, and honestly, he'd have done the same thing in my position. Said Michaela had always been dramatic and impulsive, and he was sorry I'd gotten caught up in it. That phone call meant more to me than he probably realized because it was the first time someone from her side validated that I wasn't crazy for ending things. About 3 weeks after I filed the divorce papers, Michaela pulled her biggest manipulation attempt yet. She texted me to come home early from work because she had important news, and when I got there, she was sitting on the couch looking pale and shaky. She told me she was pregnant, and my first reaction was just pure numbness, because if it was true, then everything got 1,000 times more complicated. But something about the way she said it felt off. Her timing was too convenient, and she wouldn't look me in the eye when she said it. I asked her to take a test right then with me watching, and she got defensive, said I was being controlling, and she'd already taken 3 tests that morning. I told her I'd be happy to go to a doctor's appointment with her to confirm, and suddenly, she started crying and admitted she'd lied, said she was desperate, and didn't know what else to do to make me stay. I walked out of the apartment right then and spent the night at my brother's place because I couldn't even look at her anymore. The fake pregnancy was the final straw that killed any remaining sympathy I had for her situation, and I told Patterson to push the divorce through as fast as legally possible. What I didn't know yet was that everything I'd been through so far was just the opening act, and the real truth about why Michaela wanted that open marriage was about to come out in the worst possible way. The truth came from the last person I expected about a week after the fake pregnancy incident, from Michaela's best friend Laura, who I'd maybe spoken to a handful of times at parties and dinners over the past year. She sent me a text that just said, "We need to talk. You deserve to know what's really going on." And something about the way she phrased it made my stomach drop because I realized there was more to this story than just my wife wanting an open marriage. We met at a coffee shop near my work on a Thursday afternoon, and Laura looked nervous in a way that told me whatever she was about to say had been weighing on her for a while. She started by apologizing for not telling me sooner, and then she just laid it all out, told me that Michaela had been seeing someone else for at least 4 months, maybe longer. His name was Dylan. He worked at the same office building as Michaela, but for a different company. And according to Laura, they'd been meeting up during lunch breaks and after work and basically having a full relationship behind my back. The open marriage conversation wasn't about freedom or growth or any of that philosophical garbage Michaela had been feeding me. It was about her wanting to legitimize what she was already doing so she could keep Dylan without technically being a cheater. Laura showed me screenshots of conversations where Michaela had talked about her plan, how she was going to slowly introduce the concept of polyamory and ethical non-monogamy until I agreed to open our marriage, and then she could have both me and Dylan without any guilt or consequences. She'd literally been running a months-long campaign to manipulate me into accepting her affair as something progressive and enlightened instead of what it actually was, which was plain old cheating. Laura told me she'd tried to talk Michaela out of it multiple times, told her to either end things with Dylan or end the marriage honestly. But Michaela had convinced herself that open marriages were the evolved solution and I'd eventually come around if she just presented it the right way. Sitting there in that coffee shop reading these messages, I felt this strange cold clarity wash over me because suddenly everything made sense. The face-down phone and the distant looks and the podcasts and articles, it was all just preparation for the big ask that would retroactively justify what she'd already been doing. I thanked Laura for telling me, and she said she couldn't stay quiet anymore after hearing about the fake pregnancy. Said that crossed a line from regular mess into something cruel. Laura explained something else that finally made Michaela's desperate behavior make sense. Apparently, the whole plan had been for me to agree to the open marriage so Dylan could be the official boyfriend while I stayed as the stable husband who paid the bills and provided security. In Michaela's mind, she'd have the excitement and passion with Dylan while keeping the comfortable life and financial stability with me. And she genuinely thought I'd just accept this arrangement once she framed it as enlightened and progressive enough. But when I refused and filed for divorce instead, her entire fantasy collapsed because suddenly she was facing losing everything: the marriage and the stability, and probably Dylan too once he realized she couldn't deliver on whatever promises she'd made him. That's why she was fighting so hard to save the marriage even though she was still seeing Dylan. Because in her twisted logic, if she could just get me to take her back, then maybe she could eventually circle back to the open marriage idea and get what she wanted anyway. Laura told me that Michaela had been telling Dylan I knew about them and was fine with it, that we were working toward an open marriage and I just needed time to adjust to the idea. So Dylan thought he was the other partner in some ethical polyamory situation while I thought I was in a monogamous marriage, and Michaela was lying to both of us to keep her double life going. The whole thing was so calculated and manipulative that it actually impressed me in a sick way, like she'd really thought through every angle except the one where I'd simply refused to play along. I drove straight to Patterson's office after that meeting and told him everything Laura had revealed. He said it didn't change the divorce timeline since Washington was no fault anyway, but it did give us leverage if Michaela tried to drag things out or ask for spousal support. Proof that she'd been unfaithful during the marriage, even if technically adultery wasn't grounds for divorce in our state. I also told him I wanted documentation of every manipulation attempt she'd made, including the fake pregnancy, because I had a feeling things were going to get worse before they got better. I was right, because when Michaela found out that Laura had told me about Dylan, she completely lost it. She showed up at my auto shop on a Friday afternoon making a scene in the parking lot, crying and yelling about betrayal and how I'd turned her best friend against her. My boss had to threaten to call the cops before she finally left, and even then she sat in her car outside for another hour just staring at the building. The worst moment came later that week when she showed up at my apartment with Dylan himself, some tall guy in a button-down shirt who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Michaela announced they'd broken up and she was choosing me. This whole dramatic declaration like we were in some romance movie. But Dylan just stood there looking confused and said, "We never broke up. What are you talking about?" And then he looked at me and asked if I really knew about them this whole time. I told him no. I'd found out a week ago from Laura, and I watched his face change as he realized Michaela had been lying to him too. He started asking her questions about what else she'd lied about, and she just kept trying to redirect the conversation back to me, saying we could all work this out if I'd just listen. I closed the door on both of them while they started arguing in the hallway, and that was the last time I saw Dylan, but definitely not the last I heard from Michaela. She started texting me dozens of times a day, long rambling messages about how she'd ended things with Dylan for real this time, and chose me, and we could start over fresh if I'd just forgive her. The messages got increasingly unhinged as I continued to ignore them, going from apologetic to angry to desperate, and back again sometimes within the same hour. Her parents tried to intervene again, but this time it was different. Her mom called to apologize for Michaela's behavior, and her dad actually told me he'd stopped giving her money because she'd been using it to meet up with this Dylan guy. Even her own family was pulling away from her because they could see she'd created this entire disaster herself. About 2 months after I filed for divorce, Michaela pulled her final public meltdown at a cafe near downtown where I'd agreed to meet Laura again to return some of Michaela's stuff that Laura had left at our apartment months ago. We were just sitting there talking about normal things. Laura was telling me about her new job, and I was explaining some engine problem I'd been troubleshooting at work when Michaela walked in and saw us together. She immediately jumped to the conclusion that Laura and I were dating or planning to date, or whatever paranoid scenario her brain had constructed, and she started screaming right there in the middle of this crowded cafe during lunch rush. She was yelling about betrayal and how her best friend had stolen her husband, and how we'd probably been planning this together the whole time, just completely detached from reality accusations that made no sense to anyone who'd actually followed what happened. Other customers started recording on their phones, and the cafe manager called the police while Laura and I just sat there in shock watching this meltdown unfold. When the cops arrived, Michaela was still screaming and trying to get past the manager to our table, and they had to physically restrain her, which led to her getting charged with disorderly conduct and resisting. I told the officers I didn't want to press additional charges. I just wanted documentation of what happened for my divorce lawyer, and they said that was fine, but she'd still have to deal with the charges the cafe was pressing. That cafe incident was apparently the final straw for everyone in Michaela's life, because after that her parents cut her off completely, Her friends stopped returning her calls, and even her job put her on leave pending some kind of review. The disorderly conduct charge got pleaded down to something minor, but it went on her record, and she ended up moving back to her parents' hometown about 3 hours away to stay with an aunt. The divorce finalized 4 months after I initially filed, and I never saw her again after that cafe scene. Everything else went through lawyers and paperwork. I heard through Laura that Michaela was telling people she was the victim in all this, that I'd abandoned her over nothing and turned everyone against her. But by that point, I was so far past caring about her version of events that it didn't even register. I moved into a small house closer to work with a garage where I could work on project cars in my free time. And honestly, the peace and quiet of living alone felt like paradise after months of chaos and manipulation. Laura and I stayed friends, though people love to assume there's more to that story, and my business at the shop kept growing because I could finally focus on work instead of whatever drama was waiting for me at home. The divorce taught me that some people will burn down everything good in their life, chasing some fantasy they've convinced themselves they deserve, and the best thing you can do is step back and let them handle the consequences alone. My only regret is that I didn't walk away sooner, back when I first noticed that face-down phone and those distant looks, but I guess sometimes you need to see the whole disaster play out before you understand what you were really dealing with. These days, when I hear people talking about open marriages or ethical non-monogamy, I just keep my mouth shut because I learned that for some people it's a genuine lifestyle choice, and for others it's just a fancy excuse for wanting everything without earning anything. And my ex-wife was definitely in that second category. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.